Hamtramck, Michigan. A cold morning in January 1980. The air is biting, a heavy gray mist hanging over the cramped row houses and the narrow streets. But there is something missing. A frequency that has existed for 70 years has simply vanished. For 3 generations, the people of this city didn't need a clock to tell them when the day had begun. They had the earth itself. The ground used to shudder and hum. A low-frequency vibration that rattled the coffee cups on kitchen tables and vibrated through the floorboards of every bedroom within 5 miles. It was the mechanical heartbeat of Dodge, Maine, an industrial cathedral of the motor age that once stood as the undisputed anchor of the American dream. Inside that 6 million square foot labyrinth of brick and reinforced concrete, the scene was one of industrial poetry and orchestrated violence. This was a place that breathed fire and exhaled oil, a concrete palace where the rhythm of hammers never stopped. At its absolute peak, 35,000 workers flowed through those gates in 3 shifts that ran around the clock, creating a city within a city that never truly slept. If you lived in the shadow of those smokestacks, you didn't just see the industry, you inhaled it. The air carried the sharp, unmistakable bite of sulfur and hot rubber, a scent that for many became known as the smell of a paycheck. To carry a Dodge badge number was to possess a family inheritance. It was the American Industrial Compact in its most physical form, a promise that, if you gave your strength to the line, the company would provide a home, a car, and a predictable future for your children. But on that cold afternoon, the unmistakable reality of silence finally settled over the forge. In a final clinical transaction that analysts viewed as an industrial autopsy, the largest single manufacturer factory in the world was sold to the city for the most insulting figure in the history of Detroit commerce. A 70-year legacy of craftsmanship, a facility that had armed the nation as a monument to national survival during World War II, and an empire that built the very skeleton of the motor age, was liquidated for the price of a single cup of coffee. Exactly $1. How does an industrial titan that survived the Great Depression and defined the identity of a region collapse into an industrial aftermath of dust and rubble? How does excellence become irrelevant when it hits the merciless arithmetic of corporate scale? The fall of Dodge, Maine is not just a story of a closed plant. It is a haunting lesson in the unforgiving mathematics of debt and the devastating human cost when a concrete palace is reclassified as a liability. Within months of that $1 sale, the buildings were reduced to a mountain of dust and twisted rebar, erasing a century of history to make room for a future that didn't remember the past. Did your father or grandfather carry a Dodge badge? Do you still remember the vibration of the presses in your chest, or the way the plant's siren organized the rhythm of your life? Share your family's story in the comments below. We are keeping these industrial memories alive. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. To understand the unmistakable reality of the $1 sale that eventually erased Dodge, Maine, we have to go back to a world defined by the grit and obsession of 2 men who believed that mechanical perfection was a form of prayer. Long before the Hamtramck plant was a 6 million square foot labyrinth of dust and silence, it was a dream forged in the heat of a machine shop by John and Horace Dodge. Like the Schaefer brothers stepping off a ship with a single dollar, or Bernhard Stroh arriving in Detroit with nothing but a wheelbarrow and a recipe, the Dodge brothers were the sons of the forge, immigrant-descended machinists who understood that in the motor age, a man was only as reliable as the gears he cut. They arrived in Detroit at the dawn of the 20th century, a time when the city was a chaotic laboratory for movement. They didn't arrive with titles or capital. They arrived with a reputation for being the best machinists in the Midwest. In their early shops, the brothers operated with a level of precision that bordered on the fanatical. They didn't just build parts. They performed industrial poetry with lathes and mills, obsessing over tolerances that other shops considered impossible. To the Dodge brothers, a vibrating engine wasn't just a defect. It was a violation of the blacksmith's oath. a sacred belief inherited from their father that your name means nothing if your work falls apart. This obsession with quality soon attracted a young, struggling inventor named Henry Ford. Before Ford became a household name, he was a man in search of a miracle, and he found it in the Dodge brothers. For more than 10 years, John and Horace provided the mechanical guts for the Ford Motor Company, while Henry focused on the arsenal of scale and the birth of the assembly line. The Dodge brothers were in the trenches, engineering the engines, the transmissions, and the axles that allowed the Model T to conquer the world. They were the silent architects of an empire, eventually owning 10% of Ford stock and becoming the largest component suppliers in the world. But as the 1910s progressed, the brothers began to feel the weight of a technology trap. They were building the skeleton of someone else's industrial cathedral, while their own name remained hidden beneath the hood. They saw Ford cutting costs and simplifying designs to meet the merciless arithmetic of the mass market, and they realized that their commitment to over-engineering was increasingly at odds with Henry's vision. In 1914, the brothers made a decision that sent a shockwave through Detroit. They walked away from the Ford contracts to build their own empire. They founded the Dodge Brothers Motor Car Company on the same soil that would eventually hold the Hamtramck plant, and they did it with a single goal: to build a car that would never break. Their first car, affectionately known as Old Betsy, wasn't designed for the showroom floor. It was built for the mud-caked reality of American roads. It was a monument to industrial ambition that used a 35-horsepower engine and a real gear shift when others were still using planetary transmissions. Within a single year, they were the third-largest automaker in America, proving that the public was hungry for the durability promised by the Dodge name. At the heart of this rise was the blacksmith's oath. Every car that rolled off the line was a testament to the belief that craftsmanship was a moral obligation. They paid their workers some of the highest wages in the city, but they expected a culture of performance that left no room for error. Like the Baldwin locomotives built to run for 40 years, or the fire-brewed kettles of the Stroh family, a Dodge car was built to outlast its owner. In those early days of the Hamtramck expansion, the brothers walked the floor of their concrete palace with the same grease-stained hands they had as young men in Niles, Michigan. They believed that as long as they remained true to the iron and the oil, their empire would be eternal. They were the kings of grit, unaware that the very success they were building would one day be sold for the price of a single cup of coffee, and that the rhythm of hammers they started would eventually fade into the unmistakable reality of silence. To understand the unmistakable reality of the Dodge main plant at its peak, you have to understand the man who provided the blueprint for the American industrial century. In the early 1900s, while most factories were still dark, cramped fire traps built of timber and brick, a German-born architect named Albert Kahn arrived with a radical proposition. He didn't just want to build a warehouse, he wanted to create a concrete palace. By utilizing revolutionary reinforced concrete, Kahn was able to eliminate the forest of support posts that cluttered traditional workshops, replacing them with vast, open floors and soaring 30-foot ceilings. This wasn't just a change in materials. It was a monument to industrial ambition that allowed for the birth of the modern assembly line. Inside the walls of this industrial cathedral, the design prioritized two things: space and light. Building number 10 became the global template for power, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded every level with natural light, a stark contrast to the dark, satanic mills of the previous century. These windows didn't just provide illumination, they offered a glimpse into a world of industrial poetry, where every movement was timed and every detail was considered. The walls were painted a brilliant, spotless white to reflect the sun, creating an environment that demanded a culture of performance and precision from everyone who walked the floor. By the middle of the 20th century, this facility had morphed into a literal city within a city. The complex sprawled across a staggering 6 million square feet, a labyrinth of 40 interconnected buildings that functioned as a single, breathing organism. It was a self-contained empire with its own power plant generating enough electricity for a town of 15,000 people, its own fire station, and even an on-site hospital with a full-time staff of doctors and nurses. Connecting these massive structures was a network of enclosed pedestrian bridges and underground tunnels, most notably the iconic bridge over Grand Boulevard, where something crossed every 30 seconds. Inside this fortress of iron and concrete, the rhythm of hammers never truly stopped. 35,000 workers flowed through the gates in 3 shifts that ran around the clock, creating a world that never slept. The day did not begin with the sun. It began at 6 in the morning sharp with the first punch of the unforgiving time clock. As the 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock shifts rotated, the streets of Hamtramck became a river of human labor. For 7 decades, to have a badge number here was to have a family inheritance, a piece of the American industrial compact that promised a middle-class life in exchange for your strength and loyalty. This massive operation didn't just exist in Hamtramck, it defined it. The city and the plant were locked in a state of total symbiosis, where the neighborhoods literally lived by the schedule of the machines. You didn't need a watch to tell the time in these neighborhoods. You had the plant's siren. It signaled the start of work, the arrival of noon, and the moment of quitting time, organizing the lives of tens of thousands of families who lived within the shadow of the smokestacks. When the siren wailed, the local economy shifted. Bakeries opened early to feed the morning crew, and corner taverns filled to the brim the moment the afternoon shift ended. The air thick with the mixed scent of malt, steam, and industry. To the workers and their families, the concrete palace seemed permanent, an unassailable anchor of the motor age. They walked these halls believing that as long as the world needed to move, the fires would stay lit and the rhythm of hammers would continue to beat for their children and grandchildren. They were living in a golden age of grit and obsession, unaware that the merciless arithmetic of a changing world was already beginning to gather at the horizon. The cathedral was at its loudest, and the windows were at their brightest, but the unmistakable reality of silence was only a generation away. As the motor age transitioned from a chaotic experiment into a global powerhouse, the Dodge main plant became the physical manifestation of industrial ambition. By the interwar years, the facility had evolved into an industrial cathedral of efficiency where the blacksmith's oath of quality was scaled to a level previously thought impossible. Inside the vast, Albert Kahn-designed halls of reinforced concrete, the scene was one of orchestrated violence and industrial poetry. Every floor was a sea of motion, illuminated by floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the workspace with natural light, creating an environment where every movement was timed and every second was measured. The plant wasn't just assembling cars. It was producing 200 vehicles per day with a level of military precision that became the global template for power. To look at the storage yards was to see thousands of stacked steel frames and gleaming bodies, a brilliant beacon of grit and obsession that proved Detroit was the undisputed heartbeat of a nation in motion. This era of commercial dominance, however, was merely the prelude to the plant's most critical hour. On December 8, 1941, the unmistakable reality of global conflict reached the gates of Hamtramck. Overnight, the factory was drafted into the arsenal of democracy, transforming from a commercial giant into a monument to national survival. The rhythm of hammers took on a desperate, patriotic urgency as the assembly lines were retooled to build the engines of victory. Where family sedans once rolled, workers now produced heavy-duty trucks, aircraft engines, and precision-machined parts for the Manhattan Project. The factory ran 24 hours a day, through 3 shifts that never slept, feeding an insatiable military appetite that consumed steel and rubber at rates peacetime couldn't imagine. During these years, Dodge Main was not just a workplace. It was an essential node in an invisible network that connected the iron ore of Minnesota to the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The 1950s marked the absolute high watermark for the facility and the people who powered it. At this peak, The plant employed between 23,000 and 35,000 workers, making it the largest single manufacturer factory in the world. This was the golden age of the American Industrial Compact, a sacred, unspoken agreement where a badge number at Dodge was viewed as a family inheritance. A job on the line meant a home in the city, a car in the driveway, and the predictability of a middle-class future for your children. In the neighborhood surrounding the concrete palace, reputations were built on seniority and mastery of the machines. The air in Hamtramck carried the sweet, heavy scent of industry, and the ground vibrated with a low-frequency hum that signaled the city was alive and its people were secure. By the middle of the century, Dodge, Maine had become the undisputed heart of American mobility. It had survived the Great Depression, armed a nation for global war, and was now pumping out the vehicles that defined the post-war boom. From the outside, the massive complex looked like permanence made of brick and steel, a fortress of industrial ambition that appeared too essential to ever disappear. The windows glowed like a city within a city, and the siren organized the lives of tens of thousands, unaware that the merciless arithmetic of global scale was already beginning to gather at the horizon. The cathedral was at its loudest, and its fires were at their brightest. But the first subtle signs of the technology trap and the unforgiving mathematics of debt were already being written into the spreadsheets of the future. To step inside the gates of Dodge, Maine during its peak was to enter a world of brutal choreography and mechanical symphony. While the public saw the gleaming chrome of a finished Dodge car, the men on the floor saw a different, unmistakable reality. This was the concrete palace of the motor age, an industrial cathedral where the rhythm of hammers never stopped. But it was also a place that demanded a level of grit and obsession that few modern workers could imagine. Inside the massive complex, the air was a thick, shimmering weight. On a typical summer day in Hamtramck, the temperature on the factory floor regularly climbed to 110 degrees. Near the foundry and the heavy presses, where molten metal was forged into the skeleton of the American dream, the heat intensified to a staggering 120 degrees. It was an environment of constant strain, where sweat soaked through uniforms within the first 15 minutes of an 8-hour shift. Workers swallowed salt tablets by the handful to ward off exhaustion, their lungs breathing in a sensory cocktail of lubricating oil, metal dust, and the acrid scent of hot rubber. But the heat was only half of the nightmare. The other half was the sound. The roar of the Dodge, Maine plant was a deafening, continuous wall of noise that never dropped below 95 decibels. Massive presses slammed shut with explosive force, vibrating through the concrete floors and into the very bones of the men standing beside them. In this world, speech was impossible. Communication happened through a complex language of hand gestures and practiced routines, a choreography refined by decades of repetition. This was the technology trap of the era. To achieve the scale required to build America, the factory had to become a machine that demanded its human operators behave like steel. For the 35,000 workers flowing through those gates, however, the brutal reality of the floor was balanced by a sacred, unspoken agreement known as the American Industrial Compact. To carry a Dodge badge number was to possess a family inheritance. It was a passport to a middle-class aristocracy that promised a life of predictability in exchange for your strength. A job at the plant meant a house on the east side, a car in the driveway, and the ability to send your children to college, often the first generation in the family to go. In the neighborhoods surrounding the concrete palace, the factory wasn't just an employer. It was the anchor of an entire ecosystem. You could tell time by the plant's siren, and the local taverns and bakeries lived by the rhythm of the 3 shifts. To say, "I work at Dodge," carried a profound sense of generational pride. Fathers trained their sons on the same lines they had walked for 30 years, believing that as long as the world needed to move, the concrete palace would provide for their grandchildren just as it had provided for them. The merciless arithmetic of this life was played out in a devastating trade-off. The smell of a paycheck, that sharp, chemical scent that clung to a worker's skin and clothes even after they returned home, was the sensory reminder of a life traded for security. The physical toll was the terminal installment of a debt paid over a lifetime. Men in their 40s developed the gnarled hands of blacksmiths and the scarred lungs of veterans. Repetitive motions strained joints into chronic pain, and the relentless roar of the presses eventually stole the high frequencies of their hearing. The workers accepted these injuries as the blacksmith's oath, a cost of progress that was rarely questioned in a culture of performance that valued output above all else. They lived with the unmistakable reality that they were building America with their own sweat and blood, unaware that the very system they were powering would one day reclassify their loyalty as a cost and their concrete palace as a liability. The machines were at their loudest, and the pride was at its peak, but the unforgiving mathematics of a changing world was already writing the final chapter for the people of Dodge, Maine. The tragedy of the Dodge, Maine plant was that its greatest strength, its massive, unyielding scale, eventually transformed into its most lethal technology trap. By the mid-1960s, the concrete palace that had been a marvel of the 1890s, industrial logic, was struggling to breathe in a world that now moved at the speed of silicon and automation. For 7 decades, the plant had optimized for a very specific reality where sheer volume was the primary metric of success. But as the industry shifted, that mass became a strategic constraint that made every necessary change an agonizingly slow and expensive process. While newer factories were being designed with modular layouts that could pivot to new models in weeks, the Hamtramck complex was a rigid, interconnected labyrinth where retooling a single line required the coordination of an entire, aging industrial ecosystem. Inside the vast brick walls, the rhythm of hammers was increasingly interrupted by the sound of failing infrastructure. Maintenance costs for the aging 6 million square foot giant were climbing to astronomical levels, eating away at the thin margins that the merciless arithmetic of global competition now demanded. The equipment was aging, and much of it relied on engineering standards from the first half of the century, requiring a workforce of craftsmen who knew how to coax production out of machines that should have been retired 20 years prior. This reliance on labor-intensive processes created a situation where Dodge was paying for the price of progress in every paycheck, while competitors in the South and the Midwest were building lighter, newer facilities that operated on cheap land with half the human overhead. This was the unmistakable reality of the technology trap. To truly modernize the plant would require a level of capital investment that the company simply could not justify while servicing its mounting debts. Every time the board considered a total overhaul, they were confronted by the unforgiving mathematics of downtime. To install the latest automation meant shutting down active production for months, a loss of output that a company fighting for survival could not absorb. The factory was essentially being held together by industrial triage, with maintenance crews salvaging parts from inactive sections just to keep the primary lines moving for one more shift. Compounding this technical stagnation was the landlocked reality of the site itself. Unlike the new greenfield plants being erected in the suburbs or the rural corridors of the Midwest, Dodge, Maine was a prisoner of its own geography. It was an industrial island surrounded by a rising tide of dense urban neighborhoods that had grown up specifically to serve it. By the 1960s, there was literally no room to expand, no space to build the wide, single-story assembly lines that modern efficiency required. The plant was forced to continue operating in a vertical configuration, moving heavy steel parts between floors on elevators and aging conveyor bridges, a logistical nightmare that added seconds and cents to every vehicle at a time when the market was rewarding the merciless arithmetic of the pass. Lowest possible cost. From the executive suites, the factory was no longer viewed as an industrial cathedral of power, but as a monument to abandonment in waiting. The integration into the life of Hamtramck that had once created such emotional loyalty had become a source of strategic blindness. Management continued to believe that the facility's history and its seasoned workforce would protect it, ignoring the fact that excellence is not a shield against the horizon when the very ground you stand on has become too expensive to keep. The windows still glowed at night, but the light was no longer a sign of dominance. It was the shimmering glow of a system that had been outpaced by time. The concrete palace remained a fortress, but the war it was built to fight had already moved to a different battlefield, leaving the aging giant to wait for the unmistakable reality of silence that would eventually claim its soul. By the arrival of the 1970s, the industrial cathedral of Dodge, Maine began to feel the first tremors of a world that was no longer governed by the logic of the motor age. For 7 decades, the plant had operated on the belief that scale was a shield, but as the global economy shifted, that massive 6 million square foot footprint became a target for the merciless arithmetic of a new era. The collapse began not with a single failure on the production line, but with a series of external shocks that exposed the unforgiving mathematics of a system built for a future that had already passed. The first blow arrived in 1973 with the oil embargo, an event that rewired the American consumer's relationship with the automobile overnight. For decades, Detroit had defined progress in cubic inches and chrome, but as gas prices quadrupled and lines stretched for blocks, those heavy, fuel-hungry vehicles, the very skeleton of mobility that Dodge, Maine was designed to produce, suddenly looked like liabilities. Inside the concrete palace, the grit and obsession that had driven workers to build 200 vehicles per day was met with the unmistakable reality of a shrinking market. Competition from Japan and Europe flooded the shores with fuel-efficient alternatives that humiliated Detroit's gas-guzzling tradition, leaving the Hamtramck complex trapped in a technology trap it could not afford to escape. As sales softened, the decision-making power that had once lived on the factory floor among master machinists and veteran foremen began to migrate toward Wall Street boardrooms and glass towers. The company was no longer viewed as a community anchor or a monument to industrial ambition, but as a collection of assets to be optimized by managers who spoke the detached language of spreadsheets and corporate scale. For Chrysler, the parent company of the Dodge brand, the late 1970s became a desperate debt trap. Every dollar earned was swallowed by the interest on loans taken out to survive the last recession, leaving nothing for the modernization the aging plant desperately required. Inside the walls, the decline was managed through a process disguised as efficiency. Workers watched as entire departments were consolidated and production lines were shut down for what management called retooling, a strategic mirage that promised future upgrades which never materialized. The rhythm of hammers grew intermittent, replaced by the unmistakable reality of silence in vast sections of the building where the lights were turned off to save on utility costs. Maintenance became an exercise in industrial triage, where crews salvaged parts from mothballed machines to keep the remaining lines moving for just one more shift. This grinding pressure rippled outward from the factory gates, triggering a death spiral in the city of Hamtramck. For 3 generations, the neighborhood had functioned as an ecosystem tied to the plant's siren, but as the paychecks thinned, the community began to hollow out. Corner taverns that once filled to the brim after the afternoon shift saw their tables go empty. Local butcher shops and bakeries that had thrived for decades shuttered their doors as the American industrial compact was shredded by the merciless arithmetic of global competition. For sale signs multiplied on the bungalows where workers had once planned their retirements, and the tax base that supported schools and city services evaporated, leaving the streets to crumble alongside the factory that had built them. By the end of the 1970s, Dodge, Maine was no longer a symbol of power. It was a monument to abandonment in waiting. The cathedral was still standing, and the workers still clocked in, but they were living in the shadow of a calculated crime where their loyalty had been reclassified as a cost. The machines were at their quietest, and the unforgiving mathematics of bankruptcy were closing in, preparing the city for the final thud that would eventually erase 70 years of history for the price of exactly $1. In the late 1970s, The unmistakable reality of silence began to descend upon the Dodge main plant, but it didn't arrive through a gradual fading of the machines. Instead, it arrived in the form of a clinical, administrative announcement that shattered the futures of 35,000 workers and their families. To the executives sitting in glass towers, this was a necessary adjustment to the merciless arithmetic of corporate survival. But for the men and women who had spent their lives inside that concrete palace, the news felt like an industrial autopsy performed while the patient was still breathing. The closure of a facility on this scale is never just about a building stopping production. It is about the sudden erasure of a city within a city. When the announcement was made, the shock rippled through the neighborhoods of Hamtramck, where the plant's siren had organized the rhythm of life for 7 decades. People who had believed their jobs were a family inheritance suddenly found themselves standing in the shadow of a monument to abandonment. According to historical records not contained in the sources, the decision was framed as a strategic necessity to build a newer, more efficient plant, but for the 35,000 souls tied to the old line, it was the end of the American Industrial Compact. What followed was what many in Detroit came to call the calculated crime, the destruction of the Poletown neighborhood. In an effort to keep the company's presence in the city, officials utilized eminent domain to erase an entire community to make room for a newer, smaller replacement facility. This was not a slow decay or an accidental decline. It was a deliberate, legal erasure of over 1,500 homes, 144 businesses, and 6 historic churches. In the style of the Stroh or Packard stories, this was the moment where excellence became irrelevant, and the history of a people was reduced to a mountain of dust and twisted rebar in minutes. The very people who had built the industrial cathedral watched as the city used the law to bulldoze the world they had constructed around it. The human cost of this transition was most visible among the retirees. For generations, a Dodge badge had promised predictability and a secure end to a life of hard labor. But in the wake of the closure and the neighborhood's destruction, these veterans of the forge found themselves losing the world they built in exchange for a spreadsheet correction. Like the PAB's retirees who woke up to find their health insurance terminated to save a few $1,000,000, the Dodge retirees felt the sting of a knife in the back from the institution they had served with grit and obsession for 30 or 40 years. For these men and women, the loss was existential. They were the ones who had traded their hearing to the roar of the presses and their lung capacity to the chemical ghost of the paint shops. To see their homes leveled and their community scattered was a terminal ending to a story that was supposed to have a middle-class reward. They became the industrial aftermath, discarded by a system that now valued corporate scale and efficiency over the lives of those who made the product possible. The machines had fallen silent, the neighborhood had been erased, and the unforgiving mathematics of the new economy had moved on, leaving only a landmark of absence where an empire once breathed fire. By January 1980, the unmistakable reality of silence had finally arrived at the gates of Dodge, Maine. There were no sirens, no speeches, and no crowds gathered to witness the end of an American institution. Instead, the shutdown unfolded with an administrative finality, documented only in schedules and shortened shifts taped to bulletin boards for a workforce that had already been hollowed out by decades of merciless arithmetic. For the skeleton crew that remained, the last full production runs felt strangely ordinary, a sequence of gestures aimed at closure rather than the sustaining of an enterprise. On that final operating day, the physical rituals of the concrete palace reversed themselves. What had always been a process of creation, the welding of frames and the firing of engines, became one of emptying and disassembly. Tanks were drained, valves were closed, and the air, which had shimmered with the heat of 110 degrees for 70 years, began to cool. The soundscape of Hamtramck changed forever. Where constant noise once made conversation difficult, footsteps now echoed against the cold, damp concrete. For the workers, the factory had structured their entire lives determining their meals, their sleep, and their family routines, and as the permanence dissolved, it took more than just jobs with it. The final thud occurred just after dawn. The massive steel doors were pulled shut for the last time, and for those standing in the empty corridors, the sound was not the roar of machinery, but the dull echo of an empire ending. This was the industrial aftermath in its most clinical form. An ecosystem that had once birthed 200 vehicles per day was now a shell without purpose, a structure designed for continuous motion now frozen in place. One by one, the machines were powered down, their silence felt as an unmistakable reality of absence that hit the neighborhood like a terminal diagnosis. Then came the final transaction, a deal that analysts viewed as an industrial autopsy. To facilitate the site's own destruction and clear the path for a future that didn't remember the past, the 70-year legacy of Dodge, Maine was sold to the city for exactly $1. In the world of corporate scale, this was the ultimate expression of the technology trap. The facility had become so expensive to maintain, and so rigid in its vertical design, that its total value was reclassified as a liability. Like the Schaefer family cashing out for the price of 2 six-packs, the Dodge legacy was liquidated for less than the cost of a cup of coffee. Once the paperwork was signed, the liquidators arrived with the same speed as the merciless arithmetic that had killed the plant. They weren't there to build, they were there to harvest. The valuable metal, the copper wiring, the heavy steel components, and the precision tools was stripped first. Just as the massive copper kettles of a fallen brewhouse were sold to the highest bidder or melted down for scrap, the guts of the concrete palace were sold to buyers in distant markets. The machinery that had been perfectly run for a world that no longer existed was dismantled, leaving behind only the brick skin of a tomb. The demolition itself was a spectacle of erasure. In April 1981, explosive charges were placed throughout the 6 million square foot complex. The buildings that had stood for a century, the walls that had witnessed the arsenal of democracy and the birth of the motor age, came down in a matter of minutes. In a cloud of dust and rubble, the industrial cathedral vanished, replaced by a silence that was deeper than anything the city of Detroit had ever known. There was no plaque, no monument, and no acknowledgement of the 35,000 workers who had spent their entire careers there. The land would eventually be paved over for generic corporate architecture, a landscape so thoroughly scrubbed of history that a visitor would never guess an empire once breathed fire on this ground. Today, the site that once housed the industrial cathedral of Dodge, Maine, has become the ultimate landmark of absence, a void in the heart of Hamtramck that never truly resolved. If you walk the perimeter of the ground where 35,000 workers once stood at the forge, you won't find the soaring brick walls or the Albert Kahn glass and concrete windows that defined the motor age. Instead, you are met with a monument to abandonment that has been systematically erased, paved over by generic corporate architecture that is as efficient as it is forgettable. This new landscape is so thoroughly scrubbed of history that a visitor would never guess an industrial empire once breathed fire on this very soil. The silence of Dodge, Maine serves as a haunting reminder that in the world of global industry, excellence is not a shield against the horizon. For 70 years, this factory was a monument to industrial ambition, building the very skeleton of American mobility with a level of precision that turned mechanical work into industrial poetry. But the lesson of the $1 sale is brutal. Innovation alone cannot defeat the structural reality of scale. You can build a car so perfect you can balance a nickel on the hood, and you can survive the Great Depression and 2 world wars, but you can still be erased if your technology trap makes you too rigid for a world that now rewards distance and speed over craftsmanship. This is the merciless arithmetic of the modern era. Dodge, Maine fell because its massive vertical design, once a marvel of the 19th century, became an impossible liability when faced with the unforgiving mathematics of global competition. The factory was no longer viewed by its owners as the heart of a community or a monument to national survival. It was reclassified as a variable in a spreadsheet, a node in a global operation governed by the lowest possible cost. As the sun sets over the modern assembly plant that now occupies a fraction of that historic ground, we must confront the ghost of the lion. For decades, the heraldic lion of the Dodge brothers stood for a blacksmith's oath that your name meant nothing if your work fell apart. But an empire truly dies at the moment its soul is reclassified as a cost. Outline Step 10. When a company abandons the American Industrial Compact, the unspoken agreement that loyalty would be rewarded with permanence, it stops being a producer of futures and starts being a liquidator of its own legacy. The people of Hamtramck were the first to pay the price of this calculated crime. Outline Step 8. For the thousands who walked out of those gates in January 1980, the closure was not a strategic adjustment. It was a terminal ending. They were left to navigate a world that no longer valued their mastery, finding themselves either cycling through temporary work or facing the finality of broken health traded for paychecks that eventually stopped clearing. The tragedy of the concrete palace is a warning that what feels permanent rarely is. It proves that the things we take for granted, our local institutions, our jobs, our very identities, can disappear without ceremony if the systems that support them are replaced. The Dodge main story is the story of American industry in miniature. The rise, the dominance, the arrogance, and the eventual industrial aftermath of dust and rubble. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. If you believe these stories of grit, obsession, and the silence of the forge are worth remembering, leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what your city's landmark of absence is. We are keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching.